Welcome to Post-Doom, regenerative conversations exploring overshoot, grief, grounding, and gratitude. I'm Michael Dowd, your host, and in this conversation, recorded in November of 2020, I speak with Krista Heiser. Krista is a PhD professor at the University of Hawaii in composition and rhetoric, and her passion is taking sustainability across the curriculum. In fact, she's the director of the University of Hawaii System Center for Sustainability Across the Curriculum. She loves the quote from David Orr that students deserve an education relevant to the future that they will inherit. I know Krista because we're a part of a Gaia discussion group, and she reads voraciously and is just brilliant, and we had fun in this conversation. Here you go. Well, Krista, it is a delight to see you. You look gorgeous on this election day. We're recording this on November 3rd of 2020. And what an interesting, strange, wonderful, contracting, crazy, collapsing world we live in. And I'm sure we'll go there in our conversation. But anyway, I just wanted to welcome you to this series. And to say that why I invited you is because I was just so impressed with the Gaianism group that we're a part of, the book study and conversation. There were a number of times in that conversation, those conversations, that you just said stuff that really impressed me. And I read aloud to Connie, and she was like, wow, who is this woman? And then, of course, you've read some of the things that I recommended in some of my other programs. And so anyway, it's a joy to have somebody who's really in the education world and who brings a synthetic mind where you bring a lot of stuff together. So anyway, great to have you here, and I look forward to having this conversation.
Mahalo. Thank you, Michael.
So one of the things that I've been doing in most of these conversations at the start is because, most people will not be familiar with you and your work and what you're known for and what you're passionate about. So I'd like to just invite you to just take some time and don't be bashful. I mean, really just share what it is that you are most proud of. What do you do? What are you passionate about? And what you're particularly concerned about. So it's sort of like a bio, but a little bit more personal than a bio, but not the in-depth story, which I'll get to in a little bit, but sort of just an introduction to entice anybody who watches the first few minutes of these and decides, well, yeah, I'll keep watching this one.
Well, what I'm most excited about right now is the blog that I started writing, inspired greatly by Eric Asadorian and his Gaianism blog. And once I started writing, I realized that I really had a lot to say, focused on faculty in higher education.
Yes.
So the blog is a field notes blog associated with a research study that I'm doing, where I do interviews like this one with faculty and talk with them about how they're teaching climate change and related issues. How are they teaching this post-doom conversation? Yeah. And that's really what I've been obsessed with since about 2003.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you were ahead of the game on a lot of us. I mean, I didn't wake up to climate in terms of the seriousness of climate and then abrupt climate change and then overshoot and everything else until like late 2012.
Well, I came into it through higher education and sustainability.
Yes.
We'll talk more about that story, but what's interesting about the blog is that it really is a place for me where a lot of these things are coming together, and I write things that I didn't even know I was really thinking. As you mentioned, I read voraciously. I'm a speed reader. I'm a very good reader. I love reading. I'm obsessed with reading. I read everything. So a lot of that goes in there, and then it comes out in these blog pieces. And I don't know where it's going or what it contributes to, but I feel like it goes somewhere. It feels exciting to me when I write it. So that tells me that it's going in a good direction.
Yeah,
So,
if it lights you up, then it's likely to resonate with others. How does somebody find your blog? If somebody's watching or listening to this, where do they find it?
oh, the blog is on Medium, and it's called Teaching Climate Change in Higher Education. So you can go Medium, Teaching Climate Change in Higher Education. I actually put it together as a publication. So you can see all the posts. I've done 27 interviews, and yeah, it's been really great. Before that, or I write that from my position with the University of Hawaii system. So I work with the system office for sustainability. And my role is to help faculty integrate sustainability and climate change. So I came into the post-Doom conversation through higher ed and sustainability.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I'm curious. One of the questions I've been enjoying asking folks is what language you tend to use for these interesting times. I'm using, obviously, for this series, post doom and sometimes post gloom as well. But what language do you find that resonant for you, and do you find yourself using to describe these times?
When I first heard you use the term post doom, I was like, that's it. That's exactly it. And the first time I wrote that, I wrote a post called Pure Math and the Post Doom University. I was like, that's it. The
I
Post
know.
Doom University.
Yes.
What can we do with the tremendous assets of higher education? You know, the buildings, the research laboratories, the land assets, and the faculty assets. There is, for better or worse, the pinnacle of Western scientific knowledge lives in the university, and all the knowledge of the humanities. And sometimes I think people forget what really happens in a college classroom and how amazing some of these people are.
Mm-hmm.
So, what does a post-doom university look like? How do we preserve and shift all those resources to address this accelerating climate predicament?
Yes.
So back to your question about language, I've been saying climate predicament more than crisis
Yep.
lately,
Yep.
in order to slow down.
Yep.
This is a marathon, not a sprint. So I like climate predicament.
Yep.
David Orr introduced the term planetary emergency.
Mm-hmm.
I liked that. Climate crisis, I was a little wary of, mainly from talking to folks in the community here in Hawaii. And, crisis, indigenous communities have been in crisis for a long time.
Exactly.
So I feel a little wary about that term.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I love post-doom.
Yeah.
I get it.
Okay. That's great. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that just brought a huge smile to my face, and I read it aloud to Connie, is one of our earlier email exchanges, one of our first email exchanges, where you mentioned that you had, watched several of my, I've got 3 videos, as you know, that are part of this post-doom primer, or post-doom collapse and adaptation primer. And that you mentioned that your boyfriend, who's Hawaiian, said, wow, he gets it. And he's a white guy. That was just really a treat to hear. And that you then also went on to read some of the things that, I had recommended, John Michael Greer and William Catton and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So anything that you want to say about sort of who have been the people that have been most informative in terms of your worldview, or most helpful or inspiring, that sort of thing? Mentors, anything you want to say about that?
I thought about this a little bit. Early books, early mentors. There's a faculty member here. His name's Chip Fletcher, and Chip is he's a climatologist. He's a coastal geographer, and he started giving a lot of talks, kind of like our Al Gore. Mm-hmm. And for a while, I I was a little obsessed with his talks, and I would follow him around kind of, like a groupie.
Was
And
this in the early 2000s? When was this?
no, this was more like 2014.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I was really analyzing his communications
Mhm.
and the effect it had on the audience. So I was really watching the audience and watching the shock and the numbness that I would see in the audience.
Mhm.
And so I was thinking about him as a teacher and how to convey this message most effectively, especially when your audience is 20 years old.
Yeah.
It's really different
Exactly.
if you're 55 or 60 giving these talks and your audience is 18 or 19 or 20.
Right.
So I started sort of following Chip around and talking to him about how to facilitate some follow-up from his
Mhm.
conversations, so people could really grab the information. I've studied the brain a lot. The book, Don't Even Think About It,
Yep.
Why Our Brains Are Not Wired for Climate Change, really started to unlock for me how complex this is
Yes.
as a teaching topic.
Mhm.
So I had an opportunity. One of the first moments I had when one of the first times I talked to Chip personally,
Mhm.
we'd been taken over to Hilo by the president of the university system, and
Mhm.
he wanted the Hokulea people. Hokulea was, of course, our traditional navigation canoe that sailed around the world with a message of aloha aina and greeting indigenous peoples in every port. And, it was amazing and inspiring.
Mhm.
And the president wanted Hokulea people and STEM people and sustainability people. He said, you're all coming and telling me the same kind of thing, but you're not working together.
Yes,
So
exactly.
you guys need to kind of get together. So after that meeting at Hilo, on the shuttle back to the airport, I sat next to Chip Fletcher,
Mhm.
and I said, Chip, tell me the real deal. What is it that you don't say in these talks or when you talk to the press? Like,
Great question.
what's it really like to be you?
Right. That's a great question.
And he said, I said, what should I do? Just tell me the truth. And he said, why don't you grab a 6-pack of beer and go to the beach and try to enjoy the next 10 years?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because like we're done. and the I mean
Yeah.
that he was going around giving these talks, and that's how he really feels inside
Yes.
the predicament of that.
Yes.
So Chip,
That's part of what motivated me to do this series, this posthum series, is precisely that. I wanted people who really got the big picture, including the scariest of the stuff, have done the emotional work, whatever they needed to do to come through to that place of waking up each day, excited still to be alive and to make whatever difference they can make, and trust the things that are out of our control.
mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and the network that you bring together in those conversations, like, it's different nodes of a giant planetary externalized cognitive network. And I
Yes.
think it's very, very helpful to bring these things together. Okay, I grew up in the Midwest. My grandfather had a farm. My father grew up on a farm, um, left the farm, became successful. I was sort of the first in my family to really get into higher education and experience the way that education can, kind of create a divide in a family.
Mm-hmm.
I
Are you the oldest, middle, youngest? Where are you in the birth order?
I'm an only child.
Only child. Okay.
Child. I went to college at the University of Iowa, where I don't recall learning anything anything about climate change. Yeah.
Right.
So I was
Sure.
an English major. Um,
Now, what year was this?
I graduated from college in 1992.
Okay.
Yeah. and promptly headed to San Francisco to expand my horizons, which I loved living in San Francisco. I still knew nothing about the environment or climate change. It was the height really of the AIDS crisis.
Oh, right. Yeah, sure.
So I was very influenced by, and I lived in the Castro, and I was really moved by the impact on the community, man with the lesions, and it was it was really intense and also very moving to see the community in the Castro to really live in that response. And I didn't really know anything about AIDS, HIV either. I was quite naive when I moved to San Francisco. So there was that. And then I worked at a publishing company. I was an editor, or I wanted to be an editor. And through that company, I started working with homeless adults. So, and I just liked that so much more than being an editor. I didn't like being in a cubicle. I loved being with these homeless people, and they had mental illness, and they had drug addictions, and they had HIV AIDS, and I just got along with them. It was crazy. I was like 22 and teaching these GED classes in homeless shelters, and I did that for 7 or 8 years before I went back to get my master's degree at San Francisco State. So I really came into the social side of sustainability and literacy activism. I taught for Project Read, and I worked with like adults who couldn't read.
Well, the social side of unsustainability too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And then, so it's interesting. I don't always tell this story, but I will, because it's election day today. It was actually the Bush-Gore election that, or theft, as I would call it, pushed me over the edge. I was becoming increasingly anti-corporate.
Yes.
The climate at the time was just, everybody was driving SUVs.
Yep.
I got in an altercation with a neighbor who drove an Escalade, and he actually ended up coming. I left him a nasty note about his, stupid car, and he actually ended up coming up the stairs to our apartment. And my husband at the time, he punched him in the face. The guy came up and attacked my husband. We had to go to the emergency room, broke his nose, he fell down the stairs. Well, crazy. It was a crazy time. And they were talking about projecting a Coca-Cola advertisement onto the moon. And, it was just nuts.
Right.
And then the election happened, and I voted for Ralph Nader. And I was like, yes, that was awesome, because I was so certain. And then I woke up the next morning, and it was like, what happened?
Yeah.
So I'm not even that freaked out today, because I've been there, done that, And, it sounds silly to me now, 20 years later, but we just wanted out of that culture.
Yeah.
And the only thing I could muster up to do was to move to Hawaii, which sounds so stupid right now, but I really did want to not be in that consumer, corporate, capitalist culture.
Yes.
So in some ways, what I wanted in Hawaii was to be around a diverse, different type of culture.
Did your husband make that move with you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And he's still here. He teaches actually at the law school.
Okay.
So we moved to Hawaii. And then shortly after that, 2002, after 9/11, after the towers, that spring of 2002, I still knew nothing about climate crisis, even up to 9/11, even that election. Um, and so I was walking in my neighborhood here. I live in this beautiful valley called Manoa, and I still live here. And I was out for a walk by myself, and I was walking over this little stream on a footbridge that doesn't exist there anymore. It was taken out in a giant flood. Rained for 40 days and 40 nights.
Oh gosh, I remember
Biblical
that.
flood.
Yes,
Biblical
exactly.
flood.
Yep.
Yeah, so the bridge was taken out. So this was before that flood. And I was walking and I stopped on this bridge. And there's no other way to tell the story except that the stream was flowing under me, and the wind was rustling through the leaves of the trees, and the breeze was surrounding my skin. And I was suffused with a knowing. And I realized this is real. Something's happening. It's big.
Yeah.
Everything must change.
Yeah.
And I literally ran home. I remember I ran home and I started revising all my lesson plans. I taught English 100 or English 22 first year and developmental composition at the time. And like literally from that moment, everything I taught and everything I did was focused on the environmental crisis.
Wow. Wow. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that piece of the story.
Some people have said, you know, be careful when you tell that story because it's Hawaii and I'm not Hawaiian. So I can't say, you know, that the land was speaking to me. I can't say that as a settler.
Okay, so I appreciate the deep respect and I honor the deep desire to not, appropriate or, I get all that. I get it in spades. And there has only been one way to live genuinely sustainably ever in the history of our species, and that's to have a faithful relationship to the land, an I thou personal, respectful, honorable, and humble relationship to what we would call in Western language the biosphere or the ecosphere.
Yeah.
And so you certainly can say in this conversation series for sure that there was a communion experience for you that changed your life. And that's in no way dishonoring of the indigenous traditions that are so grounded in Hawaii.
Yeah, it was really a direct.
Yes.
You know, nobody told me, no other human told me. It was a direct knowing. And that is important. And then, so from there, I read David Abram's book, Spell of the Sensuous.
Yep. He's a dear friend.
It's amazing, amazing book. And so then from there, I wanted to know more about this. So I wanted to go back to graduate school. I had a master's at the time. I thought, well, I'll study this because, of course, that's all I know is school, right? I have like 22 years of higher education, which sometimes I now wish I could undo. And I see the value of, you know, being free of that. But nevertheless, that's what I wanted. So at the University of Hawaii, there was no degree in environmental psychology, which is what I was very interested in. I was like, how do people learn this? I just learned this, but how do young people learn this? And what does it do to their sense of the future? That's the question that grabbed me and that still to this day holds me. So I wanted to study environmental psychology, which didn't exist. So the closest I could get was educational psychology. So I would go all the way through the ed psych program, all this coursework. Oh my God, I took like 4 upper graduate division statistics classes. It was like hell for me, all the coursework. everything I studied, I turned into a lesson plan, or I turned into a talk. I mean, it was really great. It took me 9 years, the whole
Wow.
PhD. So I
Wow.
spent 9 years in a graduate program, really trying to find a way to study this question of what does this knowledge do to young people, and how
Yes.
does someone take this in,
Mm-hmm.
and what is happening. At the
Yes.
same time, I'm going through my own process of coming to the post-doom
Yes.
outlook. So this is a great part of the story. So I come to the moment where I get to define my research project for my dissertation. I was really excited to do this research. I wanted to talk to adolescents about climate change and ask them what they thought was happening and how they felt about it and what they thought the university should do about it.
And what year was this roughly?
This was 2005-ish.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm a few years into a graduate program, having done the coursework.
Yep.
But my advisor at the time said to me, you can't do that. You can't study that for your dissertation because it would be much too difficult for you to first establish for your committee that climate change is real.
Oh gosh, right. Oh wow.
Exactly, right? So I'm in shock. I leave the office and I went to an office across the hall. Another faculty member named Joanne Cooper, qualitative researcher, who I was taking a qualitative methods class with. And Dr. Cooper said, that's crazy. That's a fantastic topic. I'd love to be your dissertation advisor. I think that's a really important research project. Unfortunately, I can only be your advisor if you're in my program. And I said, okay, well, that's fine. I'll switch programs. So I left EdPsych to educational administration, which I'd never even heard of, frankly. I didn't even know there was such a thing. To be in higher ed and study higher ed is very weird.
Yeah, it's a meta position for sure.
Yeah. So I entered this meta program and had to take more coursework. So it took me more years, which was fine. We get a tuition waiver because I work in the system. So the courses were free for me, and I just took my time. And I really stayed in that environment for a long time.
Yes.
Until about 2009. I actually did the first interviews for what would become my dissertation study, which was called Students as Stakeholders in the Curriculum.
Oh, that's great.
So I talked with students, and I also talked with faculty, and I also talked with administrators. And I remember one group interview that I did with all the top administrators on one campus. And the vice chancellor at the time, she said, you know, this is very interesting, and we've never talked about this before. And I think there are still administration meetings where that statement would still be true. We've never talked about this before.
Exactly.
It's a huge blind spot in higher education.
Yes.
To have a mission, to have a vision, and to not have this be central
Yes.
is terrifying, really.
Yeah.
The resources and the energy and the intellect that we could be putting into not just trying to solve, but to preparing and to laying a foundation for what will come after the collapse is a huge blind spot. It's crazy.
Yes, it is.
It's like Don't Even Think About It, that book.
Right.
And the way our mind has cognitive blind spots, it's like that, but at an organizational level.
Yes, exactly.
So I redid that study. After I did my dissertation, I know at least 2 people read it. And it did influence things on the campus that I had studied, motivated a few people there for sure, definitely has changed. And then the second was this fellow Matthew Lynch became the director of sustainability for UH System. And he knew of my dissertation work and he called me up, and that's how I kind of became like his right-hand man for sustainability across the system.
Yes.
So with Matt, I was able to do basically that same study and listen to students across the university system. And we ended up calling that study the Worry and Hope Study.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah, I actually just read the proofs of an article where we're publishing. It should be out in December.
Oh, okay.
And it's called Worry and Hope, What Students Know, Think, Feel, and Do About Sustainability.
Wow.
Right? So it's that same question.
Yes.
The same question. And a lot of people have responded to this research. There's a particular pie chart in there that shows a latent emotional atmosphere of fear, anger, sadness, shame, which is very interesting emotion, and hope. But these outweigh the hope.
Yes, of course.
And if you know anything about teaching and learning, how can you learn anything in that type of emotional climate? Exactly. So I really understand that climate anxiety, which is a big topic right now, climate anxiety comes from not talking about it.
Yes, exactly. Amen. One of my most significant mentors, probably my most significant female mentor, Joanna Macy, has been saying things like that forever. And then this young woman that I interviewed as part of the Posthum series that will be edited and uploaded probably within the next week and a half, Britt Ray. Generation Dread is a book she's working on, but she has a blog. But so a young woman and a senior major mentor are coming to virtually identical conclusions.
So many amazing people in this work. It's like putting together a big puzzle, and trying to work with my own mind, and then this collective understanding. It's fascinating. It's horrible and fascinating.
Yes, exactly.
At the same time.
Exactly. So you mentioned there was one other aspect that you wanted to get into.
So, okay. So after the Worry and Hope study, I started another study that I'm currently engaged in, which is the faculty study, Teaching Climate Change in Higher Education. And one of the amazing faculty that I interviewed, she shared about a personal struggle or crisis that she had gone through, and whether maybe that had something to do with taking on a deep understanding about the climate crisis. And that really, I really thought about that. So I'm looking at that in the data. Like, what is it that makes some people really able to understand this and some able to block it out or not see it?
Right.
So I think it's important to share that during this time period, 2010, 12, 14 time, I also went through a personal crisis where my own life imploded. I had a soulmate relationship, and I knew him a long time. It's a complicated relationship, but it was very deep. And he had suffered a brain injury, had a bicycle accident and a brain injury to the frontal cortex, causing him to lose executive function. So I said before that I had studied the brain, but I've studied the brain really up close and personal.
Yes.
And seen when we lose this frontal cortex, it's a mess.
Yes.
So it's almost like we have a collective frontal cortex injury.
Wow, that's a fascinating metaphor. I love it.
um, and
Well, so,
so
and for those who aren't familiar with the brain science, Connie and I did programs for about 9 years on evolutionary psychology and brain science, and all that thing. But a number of people watching or listening to this conversation won't necessarily know what that means to say you lose executive function. Could you just share a little bit about what that's like, so that people have a better sense of what that I want people to fully appreciate your metaphor in terms of collectively that, but
yeah,
it helps to understand what happens personally as well.
yeah. Um, well, I mean, I had been interested in this frontal cortex. So we've learned that it's not really mature until 25 or 26.
Exactly.
So I'm like, I wonder if this has something to do with how adolescents might be understanding climate change. Like, if this is the area that manages planning, execution of tasks, forward projections and planning, what is this area of the brain like for a 20-year-old? And I'm not a neuroscientist, but there's a lot of literature on that. And so for my beloved who suffered this injury, for him, it was an inability to get from A to C, and I mean, and he was an amazing, just mythic person. He had a degree in forestry, and he was an artist. He made this amazing wood art. He was just a very compelling, amazing person, gorgeous and tall and talented, and he spoke like 7 languages.
Wow.
And for him to lose the ability to reach his visions, he could see things that he wanted to do, something like going to a doctor's appointment. He could see where he needed to get, but to get there and all the things that it took, like getting up and brushing your teeth and getting dressed and eating breakfast and getting in the car and navigating all the way there and parking the car, by the time he would get to something so simple that most people just don't even think about, by the time he would get there, he's so exhausted and frustrated that the slightest little thing would just, cause him to totally lose it.
Yes.
So I used to be his brain. There was a way in which I was able to balance him and help him. And we had like a bulletin board system and a check-in system, and he'd move post-it notes from here to there, things like that. This externalized cognition to help him execute tasks. Yes. And I mean, this was a man with big, big visions, big visions that he never got to execute. And he ended up committing suicide.
Yeah, sure. I can imagine.
Which is also an interesting part of the metaphor.
Yes, exactly.
Isn't it? So this took me into at least a year that I don't even remember.
Yeah. Was he able to share with you that that's what he was going to do, or did it just come as a surprise? Yeah.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah. He left these little altars around his house. So, it was, I knew how and why, and I knew how and why.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah. So from there, my life really imploded. And I do think that there's something to how there's it's nested. There's a personal crisis. And and people said things to me like, oh, you have to burn down to the ashes, and then it'll be like a phoenix, and your life will come back. And all I did was cry for
Yeah.
like years.
Yeah.
So I think it accelerated my ability to understand the climate crisis because I'd already been there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not abstract for you.
So in my journey, I don't know exactly which article or who wrote this, but there's a comparison to the stages of grief
Mm-hmm.
with understanding the planetary predicament.
Yes, exactly.
Getting to post-doom
Yes, exactly.
is like the stages of grief,
Mm-hmm.
right? The shock, denial,
Mm-hmm.
bargaining, anger, bargaining, forget which one comes
Yeah, I
first.
think anger comes first, right?
Anger, bargaining, and then this acceptance.
Well, sadness too.
Sadness, right, sadness, and then you get to acceptance.
Right, exactly.
Acceptance. Okay, wait, so I'll just say those again. So there's these stages of grief,
Mm-hmm.
shock,
Denial.
shock, denial, anger, bargaining, sadness,
Mm-hmm.
and then you come to acceptance.
Right. And sometimes we have to cycle back through that a few times in
Right.
different order. Right, exactly.
So it matters to me with this post-doom conversation
Mm-hmm.
so it was actually, I think the first person who showed that to me was actually my therapist at the time. So I did go to counseling when I was in my personal grief.
Sure.
And I remember her showing me this picture. It had a ribbon. It was like a ribbon that went like this. And this was like maybe 2 years after the suicide. And she said, where are you on this path? And I pointed like, somewhere down, still in the bottom of the ribbon.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, you're stuck there. You're stuck. You're not getting out.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up taking an antidepressant for about 2 years, which was extremely helpful to get out.
Yes.
I couldn't get out. And I described it as this black hole feeling. My personal grief was like getting sucked into a black hole.
Yeah.
And so coming out of that, being in what's called on that thing acceptance, I feel better personally. So I can feel the difference between being in that grief, shock, denial, anger, whatever, and being like, okay, that's what happened. I can tell the story to you today and only cry a tiny bit because I've gone through this.
Exactly.
There is an acceptance. So I can relate that to understanding the planetary predicament.
Exactly.
There is an acceptance of it. And you get to the acceptance, and it doesn't mean, you're psyched about it or anything. It's terrible.
Exactly.
But it's different from the grief.
Yes, exactly. I heard Catherine Ingram in one of her talks, I think it was called Kindness in Harsh Times, where she talked about that place of really beyond acceptance, almost finding the gift is the way Paul Traverka speaks about it. But that deep acceptance then allows her to be present to the news, including the catastrophic stuff, but it doesn't land as daggers in the heart in the way that it did.
Yeah.
That's been my experience too.
Yeah. It allows me to hold space for others.
Yeah.
And so that's really, where my work is focused on now is um, helping faculty who are in a position of translating this information to the next generation, to young people. How can I support them going through this process and having the information? Does it need to take this long? Does it have to take 10 years to get there? Does it need to go that low?
Yes.
Do you have to lie on the floor for 2 years weeping to get here? Or is there some way to come to the understanding in a more gentle way? I don't know. Maybe that's what the post-doom conversations
Well, it's certainly what I am attempting to do in my 3-part sort of post-doom primer, my collapse and adaptation primer. Those 3 hour-long videos are my attempt to put together, 7 or 8 years of study and have it in a digestible enough form that it can facilitate somebody making that journey in a relatively gentle, relatively fast way, but in their own way. But that's my best attempt currently. My best offering along those lines are those 3 videos.
It's amazing offerings what you've created. And all the books that you've read out loud. What an interesting way to speak the words.
And I get to re-listen to some of my favorite books, 3 or 4 or 5. I mean, I think I've re-listened to William Catton's Overshoot a dozen times over the course of the last 5 years or so. Krista, I want to ask you, because you are just really a shining light in the sort of Gaianism world, and Eric Asadorian and his whole Gaianism project, that I align with so deeply, and I had a post-doom conversation with him, as I'm sure you know. Anything you want to say about him and that work and that context with respect to everything else we've been talking about?
Yeah, I used to describe Eric as the doomiest person that I knew. He actually came out here to Hawaii, I forget what year, and gave his talk, Is Sustainability Still Possible?
Yeah.
That's how I met Eric. And he told people things like you wouldn't be able to have pets, that pets were really unsustainable, and that this made him very unpopular. There's just things we don't want to think about. What it really is going to mean and how soon it's going to mean those things. And I still haven't quite put my finger on it. And I ask people, like, what are we talking here? Is it like Jem Bendell, imminent collapse?
Probable catastrophe, possible
5 years,
extinction.
10 years. I don't quite understand that. I guess I live in this 10 years space, but it's still an open question in my mind. But anyway, I met Eric a few times after that when he was still with World Watch. And I find it very interesting that someone who works for a think tank most of his adult life, what do you do after you work for a think tank? Well, you start a spiritual philosophy.
Yes, exactly.
I don't think he calls it a religion. I think he calls it a spiritual philosophy. What do you do? You homeschool your kid and start a spiritual philosophy. So I would mention that another important piece of my path has been the community in Topanga, California, with Dina Metzger.
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to say
that. Yeah. Dina is a really important teacher and mentor and friend. And so the first time I called Dina, I called her on the phone, and I was weeping. And she said, why don't you just come? She's like, the writer's intensive starts in something like 5 days. Why don't you come? I'm going to make a space for you there. And I just said, okay, Dina, And so I went to the writer's intensive, and I ended up going to Topanga maybe 5 times in a year.
Wow.
and participating with that community in what she calls dare, which is a Shona word for council, that she's been holding there for 30 years. And it involves healing work, and it involves counsel, which is sharing stories without having an agenda or getting to a particular place, thinking slowly and speaking in story. And that's been very important. And then
when did that begin for you?
That was just like 2 years ago.
Okay, good.
I've done Writers Intensive with Dina twice.
Okay.
And the second time was virtual because of COVID.
Right, of course.
I did it right here in this very spot, in this very valley. And some of what I wrote about was that moment that I shared with you, and how it relates to the mo'olelo, or the stories of this valley. Yeah. And there's a goddess Kahalo Puna. And so I've done some real exploration of that mo'olelo, which involves a settler mentality and the indigenous mindset. And this this beautiful, radiant woman, Kahalo Puna, is murdered. And the murderer is her betrothed, Kauhi. Yeah. And like Kauhi is the colonizer. And he murders her. And he murders her again. She comes back to life, murders her again. He keeps trying to murder this indigenous spirit, right? So this last Writers Intensive, I wrote from the perspective of Kauhi.
Wow.
Yeah. And I didn't expect to talk about this at all.
No, I'm glad you're going there, though.
I wrote from the experience of Kauhi and his sorriness. Like, what if his regret? How could Kauhi feel regret in that story? And I actually wrote this story where Kauhi commits suicide. And several different ways. He keeps committing suicide, and he ends up immolating himself. And I think a lot about suicide. I have this personal experience and dreams, and it gets in your head, and you things you don't want to see, you keep seeing them in your head. And young people are committing suicide. There's the highest suicidal ideation, which is when you can't stop thinking about committing suicide, like 12-year-olds.
Yes, yes.
Hawaii, in particular, has one of the highest rates of teen suicide in the United States.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
So this is all related. This is an existential, this is why it's called an existential crisis.
Yes, exactly.
So Dina's work, she calls extinction illness. She calls climate grief. She calls it extinction illness. She talks about extinction, and she talks about reversing extinction. How if we change our mind through what has been identified to her as 19 ways to change our minds, how do we go about changing our own minds? Because when you're inside the Western hegemony, that's what it means to be inside a hegemony, is that you can't see your own mind, you can't see your own blind spots. So that's another piece of the work that I do with Dina and her community, people that I've met through her community, such as Stan Rushworth, doing Sweat Lodge with Dina, with Stan, the land in Topanga. And the way Dina has created the village sanctuary there. So I try to live where I live in that type of relationship.
Yes, yes, amen. That's fabulous.
Another of your questions that I think I'd like to mention, and
Sure.
I think we might be coming towards our time. I have no idea how much.
Yeah,
We've been talking for a week or for 10 minutes. No
well, yeah,
idea.
we've got some time. I don't need to be at my daughter's for another half hour, so we're good. But yeah, we try to keep these to roughly an hour, that sort of thing.
Yeah. One of your questions was speaking to the coronavirus,
Yes.
the pandemic. And I think that's very important to the context and the time that we're in, especially here in Hawaii. So right now, of course, we lost 99.8% of tourism, which was driving the entire economy.
Of course.
And we knew that we needed to diversify the economy. We knew that tourism was not good for the Aina, for the land, for the oceans, for Waikiki, for the people. Yeah, but we were addicted to it.
Of course.
So, of course.
That's the predicament, exactly.
So the coronavirus pandemic has created a spirit here that is called hulihia. And it is so exciting. Hulihia is like turning around.
Wow.
It's like, no, let's go that way instead. You know? And the pandemic is providing that energy. So it's very exciting right now. And we were just speaking about books. So a book literally just released 2 days ago was called Hulihia, The Value of Hawaii, Volume 3.
Wow. How do you spell that?
Hulihia, Hulihia.
Okay, great.
No accents or anything. And this book it's open source, it's published free on Scholarspace, it's digital, and it's like 25 1,500 word essays about how to hulihia in every sector. So it starts with an essay by Chip Fletcher, kind of establishes, here's where we're at, and talks about every different sector. So I'm so excited about this book, and this hulihia feels it. I can feel it. I can. And where I'm getting to is this place. I wouldn't call it optimism. I would call it post-doom.
Yes, exactly.
It lives somewhere between doom and hope. I'm not hopeful or excited or happy in any way, but it's different from doom. So
yes.
It's post-doom, Michael.
Yes, exactly. I get it.
So I remember when we were setting climate goals for 2020 or 2030. It's like, oh, let's have renewable energy by 2020. No, it's 2030. No, 2025. Like, I remember feeling, who cares? Because it's not gonna happen.
Yes, exactly.
And like, I don't know when we were making all those goals, 2010, 12, something. And
I call it the idolatry of human agency.
Right? Like, oh, we'll just agree to keep it under 2 degrees Celsius. Like, that means nothing. What happens when you set a goal? You set a target and you make metrics, and then you don't get there. And you just told everybody that you made this big splash of what you were going to do, and then you failed.
Yep.
And then you're worse off than when you started.
Exactly.
In some ways. So this hulihia is different than that type of goal setting. It's got a different energy to it. Where does it go? What does it look like? I don't know. But I've also studied the maps and the checklists of, preppers. I've read prepper manuals, and I've, where to live, where to go, what to do, aside from that 6-pack of beer on the beach.
Exactly.
Right. And what else?
I'm glad you cycled back to that. That's great.
And yeah, I'm going to stay in Hawaii.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm like doubling down on Hawaii.
Absolutely. I totally honor that.
It's scary. Mm-hmm. It's the most remote inhabited place on the planet. It is.
Yes.
It's a giant military base. It is. We are reliant on container ships for 86% of our food.
Wow.
We are going to be increasingly in the path of hurricanes because of climate change. There's science that Chip Fletcher explains about why hurricanes have missed Hawaii, mostly for the 20 years that I've lived here. We've had a lot of close calls, but aside from Hurricane Iniki, mostly they miss Hawaii. And some people say it's because Hawaii has this, rainbow bubble over it, and is like, no, there's no rainbow bubble. It's because of the Gulf Stream and the tides and the temperature. So we're going to have more hurricanes. That's scary. But there's year-round growing season. There's air. The water situation is scary in some places more than others. But these mountains back here, they literally scrape the clouds. The mountain peaks scrape the clouds, and that makes rain. And that's amazing.
Yes, it is.
And there's aloha. And it's real.
Saying this is where I want to live, and if the universe, God, Gaia, reality, whatever, if this is where I die, this is where I die. This is my home. I think is a profoundly important. So yeah, that's where I am for the first time. I'm in Southeast Michigan. We just moved here a month ago, and we're living 2 blocks from granddaughter, and we're rooted for the first time in 20 years. Connie and I are now rooted in a place. And this is where we anticipate living, contributing as long as we can, and dying whenever that is.
Yeah. It really bothers me on a visceral level when people say, and a lot of people say this, they say, oh, if humans just die today, the planet will be fine. She'll heal herself. It's like, it's something about that really bothers me on a visceral level. Humans have a role and a relationship with Gaia, with the planet, with the Aina. And some of that is the responsibility to do these things that you've described. And I think that's where you get to with post-doom.
Exactly.
And I think that's the best thing that a young person can have is, what is my gift? What is my, the word we would use here would be kuleana. What is my kuleana? My responsibility and my honor, really, to contribute here. That's all there is.
Yes.
Now. And it could be 100,000 different things. Just pick one. Life has great meaning in this time.
For more information about this project, go to postdoom.com.